All right, everybody. Welcome. Hopefully everybody can see the screen. Should be open to kind of the main screen, how to dramatically reduce detention and demurrage with supply chain visibility. Really excited to have the folks that we have on the call today, and excited to share their knowledge, their expertise, their experiences with you. So without further ado, we're going to get started. I'll introduce these folks on the line and let them impart their knowledge.
Introduce yourself.
So the man who's been talking so far is myself, Tyler Holmes. I'm the head of marketing over at Clear Metal, but I'm not the main attraction here. We've got several folks on the line that have spent years in the industry, most of them around in the detention and demurrage side. So we've got Chuck McDaniel, former global logistics manager at Procter Gamble, spent 20 years over there on the supply chain and logistics team. Currently, he runs a logistics consulting firm, helping shippers overcome international supply chain challenges, just like detention and demurrage. We've got Chris Mazza, who's our SVP of commercial over here at Clear Metal. Chris has spent over 25 years innovating in supply chain, logistics, transportation, working for ocean carriers, freight forwarders, BCOs, you name it. He's currently in charge of our customer success over here, and excited to hear him talk. And we're also lucky enough to have Jake Meehan, who's currently the product manager over at Maersk. He's spent 10 years at Maersk. He spent 3 years specifically leading the team responsible for reducing for reduction and collection of all demurrage and detention in North America. So really excited. We've kind of got all angles covered here, from the BCO side to the carrier side, and excited to get this going. So let's kick this off. We've got, obviously, people on the call today. I'm sure we have all levels of experience, ranging from new to, just like our callers on our panelists on the call today. Tons of experience. So, but we first wanted to kind of level set on what is detention and demurrage. So on the very basics, obviously there's lots of ins and outs. But Chris, if you could kind of lead us through what the basics of detention and demurrage.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely, Tyler. Let's talk about demurrage first. So demurrage is typically charges that are applied to laden containers, and these are containers that are within the ocean carrier's possession. These can be at the ocean terminal, these could be at the rail ramp, these could be at a feeder facility, an inland depot, a container yard, you name it. Demurrage charges, they can be applied by the carrier, but there's also charges related to that. If we look at an import box, and the typical example is one's coming into the U.S., discharged in New Jersey, the clock essentially starts for most carriers when the box is discharged, and depending on the day of the week, the first business day. And many folks, as an example, get anywhere from 3 to 5 free days. So free days, we'll get into that, what that really means. And then there are charges that begin to be applied. The complexity we get into is there's import demurrage, there's export demurrage. Oftentimes it's facility-based, sometimes it's commodity-based. But essentially, the simplest charge is after the box is discharged, X amount of free days, and then certain charges are applied if you leave that container in the carrier's possession at any one of those facilities. So broadly, that's demurrage. It can happen on the import side or the export side. Usually, though, I think most people think of it as import, but not always. On the detention side, it's a different story. This is when charges are applied after the container has been taken out of the carrier's possession. That is when it leaves the ocean terminal, the rail ramp, the feeder facility, the depot, the CY. Once that gate out event takes place, If we go by a carrier's typical standard tariff, again, anywhere from 3 to 5 days are given to the customer before that container, and in the U.S., container and chassis, has to be returned. What typically happens there is detention fees are applied. If you leave it in your trucker's CY, if you keep it at your facility, at your warehouse, beyond the agreed upon free time with the ocean carrier. And again, there's complexity here. It depends on the beneficial cargo owner or the consignee, what exact detention terms are in place. And there can be a fair amount of variation in the duration based on the volume, the location, sometimes the commodity type. And of course, in both cases with detention and demurrage, there's differences by equipment size and type. So there's, in principle, it's simple. There's a clock that begins with a gate in or a gate out, or a load or a discharge, and there's charges applied. In practice, it's a lot more complex than that.
Definitely. Chuck, do you have anything to add over on that side?
Yeah, a couple of points I would add. First of all, Chris, thank you. It was a good introduction explanation from a particularly North American point of view. But as you start to go into international examples, oftentimes you'll see a lot more complexity coming up depending upon how things are managed. One thing I would point out, you mentioned the phrase free time. I always like to tell clients that I don't prefer that term. I prefer to call it prepaid time, because you're going to end up paying for that time at one point or another anyway, whether it's through your contract or how you set things up. And I guess the final thing I would point out, you hear this confusion a lot, is that detention and demurrage are actually not measurements of time. They're actually determined as a financial penalty for exceeding a period of time. And so the terms oftentimes get confused as people are going back and forth.
Yeah. On that note, on the fee side, maybe we can switch over to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the fee side. Obviously, there are costs associated with those. Chuck, do you want to talk a little bit about that as far as just the costs that are associated with detention and demurrage?
Sure. Demurrage, as Chris was saying, typically occurs in the port. And there's sometimes, again, in different countries, you'll find more complex scenarios. You may find separate invoices coming in for port storage in addition to your demurrage fee, and it could come from the terminal. It could come from the liner. On the detention side, it's usually coming strictly from the carrier, although then you get into other forms of detention, such as the chassis, or maybe even in some cases, driver detention.
Makes sense. Jake, on your side, obviously, a lot goes into this. Massive scale over on the Maersk side. Can you talk a little bit about the costs that are associated with it, and maybe even just a little bit of how you guys view demurrage and detention?
Yeah, no problem. So from the carrier side, there's a few reasons why we would charge D&D to begin with. So first of all, the carriers are going to be charged by the terminals, the rails, and the depots for storage on their facilities. So that cost is simply kind of passed in and embedded into it, along with some other costs that are administrative, all the way up to physical costs on the yard from moving boxes. So those costs are again going to be kind of built into those free times. It goes back to the point about free time isn't really being free, because to the carriers it's really not. So even when a customer is granted 4 days before any charges are assessed, in many cases a carrier could be charged all 4 of those days to have that box sitting on a terminal. Then the other 2 points really goes back to a concept where D&D charges really drive customer behavior. So keeping that in mind, idle containers don't move goods and they can't make any money. So carrier's goal is going to be to continually move cargo all the time. D&D charges obviously address that directly by keeping these flows going. And then lastly to that point, idle equipment can in many cases create congestion, also create surpluses, can also create deficits, which really negatively affects all parties involved with the shipping process, from terminals, rail hubs, truckers, customers, you name it. So it's really important to ensure that we keep a handle on all the equipment, whether it's empty or full.
Yeah, No, absolutely. Yeah, Jake, this is Chris. Yeah, to support that fully. I mean, as you know, somewhat of a background with the ocean carriers, it's expensive to maintain billions of dollars of equipment in ships and terminals, and yeah, there's got to be some motivation to use the equipment. It's also, I think, interesting when we look at the cost of detention and demurrage to speak to the point that oftentimes it seems like such a simple thing to have a grasp on what the cost is in principle. But what we often see with some of our beneficial cargo owner customers is that it's not exactly clear what detention and demurrage is, and that has to do oftentimes with the distribution of the charges or how the charges are assessed and by whom. And what I mean specifically is a lot of people struggle with the fact that maybe in North America sometimes the detention charge is embedded in the trucker's invoice. And so if they can't break that out, they don't have clarity on what they're actually paying for. And if we think of some of the demurrage charges, if it's a BCO using a 3PL or a freight forwarder who's responsible for doing a coordination of the merchant's haulage move, maybe they're taking those charges, they're paying them, but then they're putting it in an invoice that's passed on to the customer. So one of the things we see is it relates to detention and demurrage is a lot of people really struggle to get a clear handle on exactly what their exposure is and what they've paid. It isn't as simple as, hey, the carrier simply issues an invoice and everything works out fine.
Chris, that's an excellent point. You know, one of the things a lot of my clients are asking about, how do they, measure their current spend on detention and demurrage? And it's a challenge in many cases from the BCO's point of view, because these invoices come from such a wide number of angles, sometimes coming from a trucker, sometimes coming from an ocean carrier, sometimes coming from a terminal. And oftentimes as the invoice comes in, the receiving party doesn't necessarily know what's the correct way to allocate that against an internal budget. And so at the end of a fiscal year, when the client is going back and trying to measure, what's my total spend in this area, a lot of times it just, because the invoices are coming in randomly, it didn't get categorized correctly in the financial system. And so putting your arms around that spend is oftentimes a bigger challenge than people realize.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, we're talking about a single BCO in this case. Jake, on your side, I mean, you're dealing with massive scale here. How do you guys handle all of that data and making sure that everything is flowing and being invoiced in the right way?
Yeah, it's very complex on our side as well. You kind of faced it from a customer's perspective, but internally, on an external perspective, we see a lot of the same challenges. A lot of times trying to invoice the correct party and then either chasing that party to get the later party to make payments and things of that nature, whether we're invoicing the correct side, utilizing correct contract rates and stuff from that nature. It kind of gets a little all over the place. So to keep a handle on it, we really kind of rely on good communication with the customers, the vendors, set up proactive processes ahead of time so that we'll kind of avoids getting into issues, which in many cases are inevitable, but limiting them is kind of the key.
Great. Yeah, I mean, with all of this, talk about kind of trying to find invoices, things being categorized correctly. Obviously, these costs scale up rather quickly if you're not on top of it or if there's something going on. How does the BCO or how does Maersk engage in negotiations around charges that might have gotten away from someone, or there's some question around where these charges are coming from? Chuck, how about from your side? How does someone deal with that when you're working with the carrier?
Well, one of the first things I try to tell my clients is we want to actually start budgeting or forecasting for this expense, because it's ultimately inevitable. You don't want it to happen, but you need to be prepared for it when it does happen. So when the invoices come in, if you've got a way to handle them and categorize them correctly, you start to get a much better view of where your total spend is. Once you understand that figure, then you're in a much better position when it comes to actually, how do I want to plan to mitigate that? If it involves carrier negotiation, or if it involves, setting up an internal work process, sometimes just a a yard management system so that you can do a more efficient job of keeping track where containers are turning and how you're turning them effectively.
Jake, on your side, obviously, in the last few weeks we've had a major hurricane, other things going on. On your side, how does Maersk handle requests for modification or special terms or anything that's related to these costs?
Yeah, I actually came across a situation just earlier this week. Speaking of the hurricane, we had a company that had a container in, I believe it was the Charleston terminal, for about 35 days going into the weekend. And constant communication, trying to get them to get the funds paid and get it out of the terminal to avoid any further penalties, and as well as to get the cargo delivered so we can get it back in stock. And sure enough, the port's shut down over the weekend with a few days prior and a few days after. And right on cue, Tuesday, the day they reopened, we have an email in our inbox stating, "Hey, ready to pick up this container now. Since the port was closed, we're going to go ahead and need to waive these 35 days of demurrage that this has already been accrued." And so we see emails like this from time to time, and it's a little laughable, but at the end of the day, we have to take on these concepts and say, we've tried to move these boxes. Understandable, the port was closed. However, where were you the last 30 days? We're not going to be able to waive all of this, but we'll certainly look to say, okay, there's 5 days here where you couldn't get it. We'll work with you and then move forward from those standpoints. But there's a lot of different exceptions that can be involved, a lot of variations from terminal to terminal, whether you name it, port strikes, things like that nature, that all come into play, making just D&D in general a very tricky concept to handle from situation to situation.
Yeah, this is Chris. It is amazing when you think about it, what seems to be so simple and transparent and easy to calculate. Just going over the few scenarios we discussed there, whether it's a hurricane or a BCO basis, the variability in the application of the charges, whether it's detention or demurrage, and again, with all the different things that go into it, container size type, location, commodity, and then you have all these exceptions, whether it's weather-related, strike-related, congestion-related. It is kind of surprising that most of the invoices actually get issued and paid. But let's move on to the next slide.
Yeah, I mean, as Chris mentioned, I mean, it sounds, I'm a numbers guy. It sounds like a lot of this stuff, it's gate in, gate out. It's get the box, move it here, make sure that it's on time. Obviously, it's not that simple. So Chuck, can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you do with your clients to help them, whether it's yard management or anything else that goes into helping to plan for some of these things?
Well, first of all, I like to step back and look at the supply chain holistically. So it's not just a simple matter of the ocean logistics. It's also, let's go all the way back to the origin. Let's look at the manufacturing lead time, the order lead time, getting the container ready to ship. And then on the destination side, let's look at the customer. Let's look at the inventory requirements at the distribution center. So you plan out that entire supply chain, and then you look at what's the true total length of time that I need. We talked a minute ago about negotiating detention and demurrage charges with a shipping company, and frankly, the best time, everybody knows, the best time to negotiate is before you sign the contract. So if you're not dealing with these charges after the fact, what I try to tell my clients as we're looking at that holistic supply chain is, let's assume that we're going to run that supply chain successfully at least 80%, or we'll try to get to 90% of the time. But the reality is there's always going to be exceptions. So if we build our plans around, that sort of a success criteria, and then expect to pay the marginal cost once you exceed your prepaid time. Maybe showing a little bit about how old I am, but when you think back to the days when we used to, rent movies down at the store in the corner, you'd have to drive down, pick out your movie, you'd rent it for 3 days, and then you have to bring it back. Every once in a while, you would go beyond that time limit. You'd take your movie back, 5 days late or something like that, but it didn't happen very often. You don't want to go in and negotiate and say, hey, I want, 10 days on this movie every single time you rent a movie. Same thing is true with ocean containers. If you think that the majority of the time you're going to turn that container successfully in 7 days, that's what you ought to be negotiating for when you set up your contract. Occasionally you'll go beyond, but you're probably going to be better off if you can negotiate for an efficient supply chain up front. What I've found with most shipping lines is if you can work in increments of 5 to 7 days, you can usually negotiate something in exchange on your rates. If you're only going to be able to improve by 1 or 2 days, maybe not. But that's why we want to look at the supply chain holistically and figure out what's the best position to go in and negotiate for.
Thanks, Chuck. Jake, what's your take on that as far as negotiations and planning for, I'll call it free time since I'm an outsider. I know we are not supposed to say that word, but what's your take, Jake?
Yeah, I'd agree with Chuck on that. From a carrier's perspective, we want those conversations to be had up front as well. There's, some wiggle room at the beginning stages when, we're talking volume and contracts and things of that nature. We want to work with you as a carrier to make sure that, we're accommodating, again, to the extent to where we can still keep an eye on the containers, the equipment, and keep it flowing. So when those talks happen up front and they are agreed upon, and then we have some guidelines to rule by, we see the logistics flow much smoother and the partnership run very transparent throughout. And again, with your occasional hiccups, the 20/80 rule that he was talking about, I think that applies across the board. But when we get into the situations where that hasn't been done and we're running into constant weekly and sometimes daily conversations with truckers or BCOs that are just looking to try to avoid demurrage, but then can't either take action at this point in time to do that, or looking for help and assistance until they get to a point where they can. Those are a little bit tougher to extend or to negotiate when it's kind of all said and done.
Yeah, right. Indeed.
So, it sounds like, well, you can negotiate on the front end, make sure that you've got your time that you need, everything's going to flow perfectly at the port, everything goes out fine. It seems like this should be a relatively simple problem to solve, at least for me anyway. What are some of the hiccups? What are some of the reasons that this obviously is such a problem for a lot of shippers and the carriers as well? Chris, can you tell us a little bit about how some of those things might begin to be solved?
Yeah, well, I think before we get into how they're solved, I think it's worthwhile to explore a little bit. When we talk about demurrage and detention, that's a fee. It's applied. Everybody's aware of it, and it's something that's incremental and generally comes from the carrier or sometimes the terminal. Sometimes it's passed on through other trading partners, like we discussed, the trucking company or the 3PL. But D&D in and of itself is one charge. What it really indicates is that usually there's a bigger cost impact. And when we look particularly in the retail sector and sometimes with many of the bigger commodities movers, particularly ex-USA overseas, what happens is detention and demurrage fees are often an indicator of problems in accurately managing buffer stock, accurately managing lead time, and also, as Chuck had mentioned earlier, really being truly on top of the supply chain and controlling the flow of goods in the containers through the supply chain and managing that on a day-to-day basis. So there's a whole bunch of solutions out there. There's a lot of different approaches, but I guess the point that I'd like to highlight is detention and demurrage is an incremental fee, but it's probably not the most meaningful cost that's associated with box stuck on the terminal or out the gate resting at your CY or your trucker's CY. There's many other factors that come into this where D&D is really an indicator of, in many cases, a bigger problem.
Chris, you're exactly right. Most shippers or BCOs don't think in terms of pure logistics as much as they tend to think more in terms of inventory management and supply chain strategy. And so having that holistic picture and looking at what's, first of all, the value of the cargo, what's my buffer stock requirement at the DC, what's my market penalty if I do get into a stockout situation? What are my options to back that up with a different supply chain if necessary? It's understanding all those variables that come together and then work your way back down to what do I need to do to plan my logistics?
Yeah, I agree 100%, Chuck. And here we talk about how do you optimize your inventory planning? How do you understand exactly where the containers are at any given time? And then, of course, there's also those are clearly key factors in better managing D&D. But the other thing is that it's probably worthwhile to talk about, and Jake, you explored this a little bit in your earlier answer, that is as a shipper or a beneficial cargo owner working in a collaborative and close way with your ocean carrier partners by either being a better partner and telling them or negotiating with them in the early days about what your exact requirements are, and being clear about those and understanding those. So when things do happen, and as Chuck mentioned, they don't always go the right way, it's a much more grounded conversation with the carrier, and the carrier is probably in most cases much more likely to deal, I would say, favorably with BCOs who work with them up front than those who wait for problems to evolve at the end, and then you got to figure it out. But again, that's a perspective from somebody who's no longer as a carrier. Jake, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree fully with that there, Chris. That's what we like in a good customer is being a partnership. We look at it that way. Visibility plays right into that as well, with it coming to the fact that, we want you to take ownership of your cargo as much as possible. The more that you control that and look and say, hey, this is what I need, this is what I expect, then we can have the ability to deliver on that. We try to be all things to everybody, but we know that that's not really possible. We like to have a better expectation set up front when it comes to the tracking and tracing of cargo to avoid things like this. We send up proactive notifications and communication, but we always find the BCOs or the customers that really take ownership of the process and say, hey, Maersk, I've got these 3 boxes that have been sitting there for 3 days. I might not be able to get them out for 2 more days, and we're going into a weekend. Do we have any options for this? And we can then discuss that and we move forward with it. In some cases, that conversation is started by the carrier, which we would love to spend more time on. But the fact that, we have so many carriers or so many customers across the global level, it's almost seemingly impossible to focus all things to everybody, like the phrase goes.
Yeah, I mean, from what you guys have been talking about, it seems like, again, outsider here, it seems like it's a math equation, but we all know it's not that easy. What is so difficult, I mean, today with all of the sensors and IoT and everything else that we kind of see on a daily basis and talk about in the news? I mean, we're all carrying handheld GPS units in our pockets usually 24/7 almost. Maybe Jake, from your side, since you've got the most massive responsibility to be tracking these containers around the globe, can you talk a little bit about how you do that and maybe some of the difficulties that arise from that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it goes back to the massive amounts of volume that we have to move on a daily basis. The fact is that we've got this data from other entities in most cases, but a lot of it's our own as well, and then shaping it to get it to where it needs to look for a customer to be usable is sometimes challenging. And then also, the different needs of each customer can present a big challenge as well. We standardize a lot of it to get it to where we can for the masses to be as most helpful. But yeah, that I think the amount of it and what the customer is normally looking for presents the biggest challenge. Another thing that is somewhat tough is the fact that it's always moving. So, from second to second, hour to hour, day to day, it's constantly updating and changing. And so being able to adapt that data and get it out to where it is relevant can be a bit of a challenge.
Chuck, from your side, on the BCO side, how do your clients and how in your former life at P&G, how did you handle visibility, and what challenges or solutions did you come up with?
Well, ideally, what a cargo owner or shipper wants to look for is that holistic supply chain. So we can look at, again, going all the way back to the origin, the manufacturing. How long does it take to prepare my orders? And then as the orders are coming in, I'd like to know, where are they? What do I have that's currently in my receiving DC that's ready to go out to the customer? What do I have that's sitting outside the DC in the yard, knowing where that inventory is, how much is available? What's sitting on the terminal at the ocean dock, and how long is it going to take to get that to the DC? And then when you start thinking about what's out on the water, what's coming in next week at the terminal, what's coming in 2 weeks, what's coming in 3 weeks, being able to see that entire supply chain and a visibility dashboard, that starts to then enable some very powerful decision making in terms of how do we optimize our planning. And yes, you're still going to have exceptions. Jake mentioned the hurricane a little bit ago. You're always going to have problems that are unexpected, and even some that are expected, port congestion or what, all sorts of different reasons. So there will always be exceptions to your plan, and the visibility gives you the opportunity to see those sometimes even before they occur. You can see where the bottlenecks are beginning to pile up, and you can start to plan for that. That gives you the best opportunity to get in front of the 8 ball.
Yeah, and this is Chris. Absolutely. It's no mystery we're big supporters of visibility. We think that is the solution, but so often what we see on the BCO or the shipper side is where things get into trouble is exactly that. They lose sight of where the actual shipment is and the associated containers with that shipment. And, a lot of BCOs, as we know, they don't really look at although everything goes in a container and the per diem or the detention and demurrage charges are assessed on a container basis, they're really looking at SKUs, shipments, line item levels, and they're tracking on that basis. Fundamentally, in many cases, their view of the world is based on of course, on the cargo in the container, not so much the container itself. So having the ability to understand where your shipment is at any time and the associated containers, or as it pertains to the bill of lading or the booking, so they have the right reference information so they can clearly grasp, hey, where are the problems? Because sometimes when you're just looking at a shipment with 20 containers, it might be difficult to understand that while 17 of those have gone swimmingly and everything's good, it's off the terminal, it's at your yard and you're devanning it. Those 3 that may have been forgotten at the terminal, those are going to incur charges, and they're going to rack up pretty quickly. And as we mentioned before, that is a big knock-on effect, not just on D&D costs, but that impacts your overall supply chain. And then, whether it's buffer stock, whether it's lead times, or also as importantly for many of our BCO partners, the financial costs associated with that. And we'll get into that more in just a moment. But again, highlighting the fact that if you don't know where the box is, if you can't see it, it's very difficult to manage it. And if you're not managing it, you're probably running a good risk of getting into trouble on either the detention or the demurrage side.
Let's talk a little bit about that. Everybody's kind of mentioned, that D&D is, maybe a symptom of a larger problem, or kind of, a subset of these issues that are out there. Let's talk about a little bit of, if you're able to see the problem, what other things, potentially valuable things can come out of being able to see the problem. Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the focus should be on the at-risk boxes, those that are most likely to incur detention or demurrage, because from a frontline position as a BCO, as Chuck mentioned earlier, you're doing your best to mitigate those. You're trying to plan your supply chain. You want to be on top of it. But it isn't just about D&D. When you have the appropriate visibility and you can see where your containers are at any time, and you understand the risk associated with that, oftentimes there's a whole host of value drivers behind that. It isn't just about mitigating D&D. If we take the example of some of our retail partners, what they're really looking for is a reduction in stockouts. What they realize is, hey, if that box is sitting on a terminal somewhere and hasn't been devanned, that means the goods aren't in my warehouse, or whether they're cross-docking or transloading, they're not on their way to the store to be sold. Some of the other customers we see, maybe more on the commodity side, if you're not ensuring that you're delivering within the agreed upon delivery window, some folks it's 3 days, some days it's 5 days, some folks it's 5 days or 7 days. What happens is the customers become dissatisfied. And for most businesses we see, that results in customer churn. And losing a customer is one thing, but the thing that has to be kept in mind is it's not just losing a customer that has a negative financial impact. It's also the cost of acquisition of a new customer. And again, it depends on the segment, it depends on the business, it depends on the commodity. But when we look at the areas of value related to profitable growth, these are three big ones. Going a little bit deeper into more of the financial and operational side, we talk about margin improvement. One of the big things we see across the industry, whether it's with the BCOs or the 3PLs, is the enormous amount of manpower spent just looking to figure out where the containers are and attempting to calculate, are they about to go into detention or demurrage, or are they in detention and demurrage? And relatedly, when you have a trucking partner that you're working closely with, who has the box? And in the case of the United States, who has the box and the chassis? And what are the costs associated with that? And where do I stand at any time? So I think when we talk about reduction of detention and demurrage and better management of detention and demurrage, the premise is that visibility helps mitigate that. And if you're proactive and you can understand the at-risk boxes, you can address it. But the key thing is the focus is on the D&D, rightly so, but the other underlying costs and the overall impact on a beneficial cargo owner or on a 3PL or on a shipper is actually much wider than that.
Yeah, Chris, one of the good things coming out of this discussion is just in the last couple of years, we've seen the cost of visibility tools really coming down. The complexity remains, and especially when you think about where the data sources are coming from. A lot of people want to just blame the carrier. The reality is the data is actually usually coming from third, fourth parties. From a trucker, from a terminal operator, or even a franchise of a different company. And so the data quality coming together and getting it aggregated up into a visibility tool is a technical challenge. But the tools now in the last 2 to 3 years have become more and more available. And so we see the cost of this challenge being reduced, and the value is really starting to become much more apparent. And when you look at as you're talking about the value of the inventory and how that affects the customer side of the business, it becomes increasingly significant that these visibility tools are paying for themselves very, very rapidly.
Great. Thanks, Chuck. Jake, do you have any comments on this area of value of visibility?
No, I think everything that was said holds very true. We hear the same things from partners across the board that work with us and along with other carriers. It really makes it an easier situation when things aren't ideal. And as we know in the shipping world, things rarely seem like they're ideal and moving perfectly. So I think it's just overall always an improvement. It's good to see that the data and the technology is finally catching up in the industry to kind of see what we can do with it. And I'm sure there's going to be more to come.
Great. We do have several questions from the audience. Feel free to continue sending those in our way if you use the dashboard that you have in front of you. Want to take the first one here, which is it's not totally clear what type of companies that visibility is suited for, commodities or just global shippers in general. Chuck, do you maybe want to take that a little bit? What type of companies usually benefit from a visibility solution?
Well, it's a good question because I think the answer has changed just in the last couple of years. It used to be just because, we were talking about sensors and that being a standalone solution, it was expensive to justify this. And so the types of companies you saw were people in electronics or high-end apparel, biopharmaceutical companies of that sort. Today, with the cost of technology coming down, and also particularly that it's no longer always going to be sensor dependent. There may be cases where you choose to justify a sensor, but a lot of this technology is available now through platforms that simply aggregate and then forecast data and container positioning, so that the cost of this level of visibility has really been reduced. And I see more and more BCOs in I don't want to say lower value cargo, because everybody's cargo is valuable, but the cost per container of cargo contents is becoming so affordable that more and more people are shifting over to this regardless of the nature of their business.
Chuck, this is Chris. Absolutely agree with that. A little bit self-servingly, what we would say is what we see. Whether you're a BCO shipping, 500 or 1,000 boxes a year, or 50 or 100,000 boxes a year, to you, your cargo is valuable, your supply chain is important, and better management has a meaningful impact cost-wise and financially, if you can do it. And so we generally see visibility for most folks. Yeah, it's very important. And because, yes, the ubiquitousness of solutions out there, you want to, of course, select the right one. And we believe we know which one that is. But you want to have a solution that you can have better visibility on. We do believe that most people can benefit tangibly and quickly from the application of visibility solutions.
Great. We talked a little bit about different sizes, obviously, of companies. Talk a little bit about the visibility and who benefits. It sounds like, from the cost, nearly everyone could benefit from that if you're shipping over the ocean. Tell me a little bit more, Jake. I mean, there's such a variability in these costs that are out there. Do you negotiate with everyone? I mean, does everybody have the ability to kind of come in and work with the carriers to get a little bit better terms, longer time, whatever that might be? How does that kind of work on your end?
So you can't really make a broad statement to cover that, but is there negotiations involved? I certainly think that the answer to that is yes. Is it every time, and is it for everybody? I'd say no. Again, there's a lot of factors into those type of talks, but in a sense, what we do see generally across the board is, big or small, it definitely, D&D definitely affects them. The bigger the company, sometimes they say the harder they fall. You could be susceptible to some serious charges if something goes wrong and you have a significant amount of boxes sitting for a significant amount of days. So yeah, again, getting ahead of that earlier and then try to plan for the best, but then preparing for tomorrow is kind of the way to go about it. But yeah, I think again, going back to the visibility and then the technology piece of it, anything to help keep an eye out and avoid things from a proactive standpoint has always benefited both the carrier, the customer, ultimate customer, and everybody in between.
Well, Tyler, the flip side of that is a lot of times I found the smaller BCOs, Jake is right, it's much harder to negotiate. But if we step back and look at a holistic supply chain, and again, going from manufacturing all the way through to the end customer, we can usually find opportunities in supply chain improvement to become more efficient, where the cost of detention and demurrage usually is not the biggest factor in supply chain decision making.
Thanks, Chuck. Sorry about that noise in the background. We've got 3 more minutes. Chuck, do you have any closing thoughts?
You made the comment earlier about, seems like a mathematical formula, and that is in fact a correct statement, but the biggest challenge to that approach is typically finding the data. Most of the clients I work with they know what their problems are, but actually finding the data to go in and start running some of these formulas and doing the analysis, that seems to be the difficult part. Once you identify your goals and objectives, putting a efficient supply chain plan into place becomes a lot simpler when you've got the data.
Makes sense, starting with the data. Thank you. I wanted to thank everybody on the call that attended today. We'll send out the slides and the recording as well once that's all packaged up. Also wanted to thank our panelists for their time and their expertise. If anybody has any questions that come up after we hang up here, feel free to send them over to us, and I'll be happy to answer them. We'll get our experts to answer them. And I would love to hear more from you. So if you have questions, whether it's about visibility, D&D in general, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here and would love to help. Thank you, and we'll be having another one of these soon, so be on the lookout for that.
Thanks, Tyler. Have a good day, everyone.